to great heights. Should say that our sponsors, especially the Baum Family Fund, should be really proud of what we've been able to achieve so far. But there has been a question that lingers. Where do we go from here? Indeed, Adam from the last panel, one of the speakers, I think it's fair to say he spoke for everyone when he said that we've learned that it can't be business as usual anymore. We can't think about transportation in the same way anymore. We can't think about policymaking in the same way. We can't build cities in the same way. A perfect segue to our next panel. Our next panel brings together three people from the architecture and design firms Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Doug Voigt, urban design and planning partner, Yasmin Kologlu, design director, and Mark Nagus, design studio head. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much. And the timing is perfect. Systems thinking requires design thinking. In a word, help us, help us solve all the world's problems in the next hour. Doug, Yasmin, Mark, it's yours.
Well, thank you, Eric. That's a fairly ambitious agenda and set of expectations. I would like to thank you for thinking of us and inviting us to this important conversation around the future of our planet. We're truly honored to participate and contribute what ideas and thinking we've done as really an integrated design practice, driven to solve the most pressing challenges of our time, but through a collaborative model that brings together many disciplines in architecture, engineering, environmentalism, and scientific research. That said, we are a design practice. So what we thought would be helpful as a place to begin is sort of to share in just the first 10 minutes some of the things that have challenged us to think about these questions Eric put forward, but also how we can respond, and perhaps more importantly, what we can do together as we look at the future of cities, our infrastructure, and our ecosystems. And so maybe with that, and let me just see here. Can you all see this okay? Eric, just a thumbs up. Okay. I thought this was an interesting place to begin. This is a cover from the New Yorker back in 2014, but sure seems like something we all lived through in the last year. And the conversations we've been having about the future of our cities, health and well-being, as well as how we look at energy and livability. We are living in an era of unprecedented change. Just in looking at our preparation for today's conversation, I think it was back in 1970, there were around 3.8 billion people on this planet. And today we're at, I think, just over 7.8 billion people. And in those 50 years, really interestingly, it's since the founding of Earth Day, we've seen a dramatic increase of urbanization that is no doubt tied to a number of those things and challenges we seek to address. But also during the same time, we saw a 60% reduction in animal populations around the world. This current system is unsustainable, and I know you all know that, but it's not going to be one thing that shows us the path forward. It will be the work of a collective. It will be the benefit from bigger thinking and greater collaboration. And I think what we'd like to share today is just a little insight to some of the research we've been doing around this topic, but then the actions we've taken as a design practice to not only influence our own work, but to influence the profession. So just to make the point even more clear, this is all information from the United Nations, of cities today between 500 and 1 million people. And that over time, we've seen an increase of cities over 5 million people. And even more increasingly over 10 million people. And sort of the real challenge and kind of this threshold we're at is that by 2030, there'll be over 40 megacities, people of over 10, or cities of over 10 million people. How we address this will be more than the building and infrastructures alone. It'll be how we look at a more holistic approach to the design, not only of our ecosystem, but our human footprint. Because one of the things, and I'm sure many of you have seen this diagram from 1972, interestingly, Jonas Salk and now his son, Dr. Jonathan Salk, have also looked at a new reality of what is our carrying capacity of this planet, and where are we on that timeline to where resources will be depleted and population may no longer continue in its current trajectory, but actually start to decline. And so there's a lot of questions that we all need to consider as we practice, but also as we prioritize new research, new interdisciplinary endeavors to tackle some of these challenges, such as the relationship between food, population, and resources. And maybe before I turn it over to Mark, this is of the essence for SOM. This was one of our founding partners back in 1969, that when Nat talked about the marks we leave on the earth of how we will be known and judged, it is the human footprint. And it's our approach that we can put forward during that time to reverse the negative impacts and perhaps establish a new ethos of urban habitat.
And actually, Doug, if you wouldn't mind going back to that quote real quick.
I sure can.
Thank you. And you know, when you consider the scale and the scope of work that we're afforded to do at SOM, we really do take this quote to heart, and we almost use it as a tenet, or we attempt to use it as a tenet of how we practice and how we want to be thinking about our worldview. And for us, realizing that solutions need to be designed, which is theoretically what we do best, and not merely just discussed. So for us, we took it as a challenge to really start thinking about how can we design ourselves into a better reality. If you go to the next slide, Doug. And you know, outside of this group, many people think that climate change is a uniform problem. But what we can see, maybe more than any other discipline, is that the impact of climate change is deeply contextual. Each region, each city are facing a unique combination of challenges that are based on everything from our human footprint to natural resources and even vulnerability. And as designers, architects, engineers, we don't have the luxury of passively thinking about climate change. For us, it's clear, it's a clear call to action. How will cities adapt to their new reality? And how can we, as designers, help lead the way? And this is really what our initiative, one of our initiatives, the Climate Change Project, is intended to be all about. Thoughtful solutions inspired by the evidence-based reality of climate change.
Oops.
And the Climate Change Project has become really a firm-wide effort that represents 7 different offices and almost 100 passionate designers. We've begun to compile a vast amounts of GIS data, which include hundreds of maps and graphs that are assessing 12 cities at 4 distinct scales. And for us, it's an unprecedented way to look at the places in which we live and work. And for us, we hope it's just the beginning of this expanded database. Next. And we hope that the climate impact database will continue to expand as an ever-evolving resource that helps us stay educated in a continuously changing world. But this isn't just an intellectual exercise. For us, the project is ultimately about pushing us to be smarter about our design, to find ways of having real-world impact in this critical time. And the resultant design proposals describe future cities if bold strategies are adopted to combat climate change. These strategies are born out of thorough research, which determine the most critical and most at-risk components of each of our home cities. They show a bold vision for the future based on an informed understanding of our world today. And that climate impact database, what it did is it evaluated each of our home cities using GIS data that was pulled from a variety of different trusted resources. Because we didn't want to just jump into designing something for the sake of designing something. Instead, we wanted to design strategies or design solutions at a heroic scale that were informed based on information, based on data that anybody could acquire, anybody could understand. So we looked at things like the pre-anthropogenic biome. So basically what our worlds were like before we touched down in its most verdant state. But then compare that with where we're currently at, with our current altered state, our current altered and manipulated state, based on the human footprint and the human impact upon our world. Next. And then we evaluate what's left. And we ask the question, how can we, as designers, learn from our mistakes, adapt to the new reality, and mitigate future issues? And through the collection of those maps and evaluating the information that we received from those maps and diagrams, we targeted where we saw each of the different major issues that we were seeing in our own home cities and proposed interventions, some theoretical, some at the scale of a home building component that we thought could ultimately impact major change in our own home cities. And so while our research and design effort doesn't necessarily solve the world's problems by any stretch of the imagination, the goal, the ambition, and what we think it started to do, at least in our own offices, is that we can become better informed about what our discipline can do and what is at stake in our own home cities.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. And I think a key part of this equation, as Mark mentioned, it's not just designing our projects to be more sustainable to respond to climate change, but we also look at designing our processes to influence more projects, more firms, more the industry. So what do we do for this? And I think part of it is talking the talk, but also walking the walk. So we want to briefly talk about some of these processes or initiatives that we've introduced internally, and also some of the efforts that we have externally with people, individuals like yourselves also. So some of our current commitments are AI 2030, China Accord, SE 2050, WGBC 2050, and the net zero carbon buildings. And probably some of you are also committed to similar efforts. But what this does for us actually fundamentally is that we are committed to net zero operational carbon emissions for our projects by 2030. And more importantly, net zero embodied carbon also in 2040, adding to that. And I think we are working all together towards a net zero carbon economy by 2050, thinking of the broader picture, broader vision. And as we do this, I think one goal that continues to keep on coming up is how do we decarbonize our built environment beyond and fast and at scale, project by project, but also thinking of the bigger picture also. And we have 5 interconnected initiatives that we pursue. And these are all linking to the broad idea of decarbonization. SOM 2040, 2030, both linked to operational and embodied carbon. Green materials and the specifications linked into how we choose our materials, make sure they're healthy as well as low carbon, and 10 principles tying all of these initiatives together. Starting with the operational, every project we do, reduce energy use, primary focus, then it's supplemented with renewable sources, but also design, think of the future, design for future electric buildings, also consider renewables on-site and off-site, as well as the green energy offsets. Yet that's also gives us an opportunity to actually track every single one of our projects. So we collect this data continuously, and we actually look at it very carefully, try to identify trends, try to identify ideas that will improve location-specific, program-specific uses, area-specific uses, and track it and continue to improve our designs to push the performance of each one of them forward. And at the same time, we don't just do this for operational carbon, but also we expanded this idea to the whole spectrum of the whole life carbon, starting all the way from upfront embodied to all the way end of the life. And this includes from the manufacturing process to use of the building to the landfill, what happens to them at the end of their lives also. And of course, I mean, probably many of you know, these require, not all of these are as developed as maybe operational carbon. So at times we actually have to design our own tools. So we have many tools that we've developed internally to calculate and augment our designs and processes in every aspect of the way. And this is one of our embodied carbon 101 tool that we've developed in-house. The next initiatives that we wanted to briefly mention is actually processes that I wanted to mention is the green materials and the specs. So the idea in this one is how do we make sure that the materials we use, we specify, select, and build can be more healthier materials, but also lower carbon materials also. So the first idea was prioritize sustainable healthy materials through an education and through impacting our master specifications. We look at actually 3-step process. First is design guides to make sure that our designers and teams are informed and they have the information education tools they need. The second one is a material selection portal. We've created actually a material selection portal that can respond to our needs, but also allow us to select the material that could be the most applicable for this particular project. And finally, taking it one step further to specifications, make sure that those ideas that we establish early on in the process can carry up all the way to the end of the process, to construction and beyond, to achieve the decarbonization goals that, ambitious goals that we're setting together. And the final initiative that we wanted to mention is 10 principles. While we talked a lot about energy and carbon, we believe that actually a sustainable approach comes from a holistic approach too. We need to think of our buildings, environments, and as an ecosystem. So we're looking at 10 principles in every project, from varying from ecology, energy, carbon, water, resiliency, waste, materials, and actually identifying key opportunities and challenges in each one to be able to address them effectively in our designs. And we have 2040 goals for each one that we work very hard towards every day. And you can see some of them: 100% operational energy reduction, 100% embodied carbon reduction, water reduction, etc. And this requires an active monitoring and actively engaging in the design, from early design process all the way to construction process as well. And you can see an example of what this looked like in one of our projects, the Billie Jean King Main Library. And you can see quite specific actually what were the incentives that we were able to use, initiatives, different strategies used, and what we were able to achieve in this design process all the way through. And we believe that also achieving, improving our designs are extremely important, but also as important as working together with individuals like yourselves to actually create a bigger impact, to really grow the impact potential of these efforts, and to raise awareness of our industry, incentives, and create new policies that we think are future thinking with individuals like yourselves. Some of these include certain guides, for example, the Architect's Guide to Progressive Carbon Reduction Codes, and what can we do as designers, as architects, and design these together with engineers, building professionals, architects, urban planners, and interior designers. And at the same time, not only stop there, but think of the local influence we can have and federal influence we can have too. So policies like this one that you see on the screen is called the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act in New York State. It's a LECLA policy that looks at how can we incentivize low carbon concrete at the state scale, basically. So influencing this type of ideas that really helps amplify the impact we can create. And finally, also thinking of the federal scale, maybe, we were quite influential and we helped co-author a industry letter response to the Biden administration to encourage how we can take action, further action in green buildings. And it focused on 6 different aspects that we thought as an industry was quite influential. And we co-authored it with people like yourselves, enhancing federal building standards, creating healthier buildings, more carbon conscious buildings, and really promoting healthy and social aspects of our environments, not just staying with the building scale also. So hopefully this type of initiatives give you an idea of what we work on day to day, both in projects, in our processes, in our firm, but also outside with individuals like yourselves. And hopefully this gives us all some ideas, and maybe there'll be future opportunities that come out of this too. And I think this brings us to the end of our presentation, and we look forward to our conversation together. Okay,
well, Doug, Mark, Yasmin, thank you. We've got questions coming in, so now the juggling begins. Question coming through Twitter and the delayed feed. Jeff Grace at MIT Lincoln Labs will have sent in a question. I mean, so first we're going to ask a question that has to do with context, just to continue to build out, give a sense of where you are, where you're coming from. Architecture broadly conceived, perhaps, this is my kind of input, perhaps the first profession to start thinking of the challenges and possible solutions. And I'm thinking 2002, William McDonough's Cradle to Cradle, which was influential, et cetera. How did each of you come to this profession? When and how? And also, more importantly, what's new, what's changed since you've been in this profession? Sort of a contextual question before we get to some of the detailed questions that are coming through in various places.
Wow. Maybe I'll just go first to give my colleagues some time. So the question of the work Bill McDonough and there's many others since then was very influential. Leadership by groups like LEAD, as well as professional organizations, I think also made a very intentional effort to do many of the things we're talking about, and we're all building on their early success. But the aspect of larger ecological thinking goes back even further. So people like Ian McHarg, who was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, was one of the first to start to overlay mapping by hand to look at the relationships at a regional scale between habitat, conservation, urban footprint, transportation networks. And I think what he was raising was that we have to be aware of how these overlap, but also if we're creating breaks in the chain, especially on the natural systems that, as Mark pointed out through some of our mapping, have existed long before any human settlement. Sort of your second question of how just personally I got involved, I think all of us here on this call from SOM were trained as architects. I think the platform of design gave, at least myself personally, the opportunity to explore bigger questions and actually help facilitate a dialogue around creative problem solving, which is part of design thinking. It's creative problem solving. And perhaps what has changed the most is the acceleration of technical expertise and data modeling and computation that allow us to iterate ideas much more quickly to inform designs while we're in the design process. I don't know if Mark or Yasmin.
Yeah. One thing I was going to highlight that I have perceived in my time at SOM, my 12-year stint at SOM, has been a big shift in client education. One thing that started, talking about sustainability in a client meeting 10 years ago takes on a very different tenor now. Like originally when we were doing it, we really had to do some strong arming and convincing to get them to see the light and see the benefit of some of the strategies that we were proposing. I think a lot of that had to do with we were educating ourselves about how best to describe what we were attempting to do. And I think we've gotten a lot better at it, as I think Yasmin clearly illustrated in her sequence of slides. But I've also noticed that the clients themselves are becoming more informed and more educated. I think a lot of that has to do with shifts in policy, obviously, depending on where we're talking about. Some of that has to do with just their own worldview about what they should be doing as clients. But I do think a lot of it just has to do with this is becoming maybe a little late in the game, but it's becoming the new norm about what our projects what needs to be embedded in our projects in terms of their sustainable thinking. Whereas it was previously seen as a negative cost impact to them is now seen as a must-have or as a assumption. Some of them even that it's an assumed position for the project.
Maybe last thing I add to that, I think we're in a very fortunate position as a profession. I think as designers, we have the chance to combine science and aesthetics together. And they both require very specific skills. And one requires extreme data, the other one requires extreme visuals also. And we're in this tough yet very fortunate position. So I think many of the work that you're seeing on the screen today is really taking on that. And I think what's changing very dramatic, and it has changed, is the collaboration. And we are almost conduits at this stage. We realize that none of us can do this alone. And we can complete each other by collaborating, by working closely together. And I think that's in the industry, that's really quite a fundamental shift in attitude.
That's a great lead into the next question that I'd like to get. Fiz, be ready with your question. Doug, you mentioned iteration as part of the process is crucial. Yasmin, collaboration, and then Mark, I think you were saying that just the greater awareness has been also very helpful, more receptive. So I think it's part of that whole process. So then Fiz asked a question about context and this global approach. So you have a process, but now Fiz, you had a question I thought really complicated some of the process and approach. And given that this is an international audience in extreme, Fiz, do you want to ask your question about international?
Yeah, for sure. So as we know, the climate change or climate action is kind of an international, it's an international movement now. So I want to ask, does SOM adopt a similar sustainable approach for its international projects as well? And how are the local variables factored in while making decisions related to the project's future climate impact? Because there could be some governmental pressures, the budget, other factors that come into play which limit practicing certain factors that you have mentioned right now. So how does working in a less low budget economy or low budget project change the things that you've presented today?
I think it's go on, Doug.
No, please go on.
I think, we often say that, we are finding local solutions to global problems. So, and we call it glocal sometimes. And you're absolutely right to point out that, not one solution, one size does not fit all. One solution cannot apply to all either. So, for example, the 10 principles that I showed you, you will see that those 10 principles are customized for every project, every location. So there's not one that fits all. And those 10 ideas actually give us a chance to customize it in all 10 aspects. And they could mean many different things in different locations. I don't think we can compare, a European project to a project in Southeast Asia, for example. So we try to customize the design response very specifically to the location, the project, and the needs of the project too.
And I also think that we as designers need to, or try and find the win-win strategies, the strategies where we get the design solution that we're looking for, while the client, the cities that we're working with, get the added benefit of the sustainable, embedded sustainable strategies that come along with them. So it's easier said than done in a lot of cases, but really searching out those sustainable features or the sustainable attributes of the projects that are win-win solutions for both us and the client are we find to be the easiest way to get approval, regardless of where we're working.
I just have a small follow-up question. So do you guys take into account that you guys have to implement have a sustainable approach in all your projects, or does it depend on the client whose project you're building? Does the demand have to come from the client, or is it that you just adopt the approach in every project you do internationally?
For us, it's not a question. It's how do we navigate either the client, local governance, other variables that we can't control and maybe we aren't even aware of before we start. And I say that because one of the things that just occurred to me when talking to this global group, all of you here today, is having access to data varies dramatically in different parts of the world. And so to Yasmin's point, if we're going to do a deep dive to understand the relationship of water, energy, and carbon in one part of the world, we need to have some level of data and information to inform that thinking. And if we are missing pieces, it just makes it more difficult for us to be not effective in our design, because we'll push and we'll challenge and we'll question and we'll interrogate. But it may then prove difficult for us to communicate the benefit to the client and the government in which we're seeking to get approval. So it's kind of, we have to have all hands on deck.
Doug, I don't know if I can or should bring this up, but your question is even more poignant than you realize. Doug, you had mentioned in passing when we were doing a dry run on this, something about Mars even. What, do you mind? Just, is that okay to ask that question?
Yeah, and actually you've got people on this call who maybe were more involved than myself, but you know, the firm has kind of always seen itself as a pragmatic visionary. So definitely today we want to talk about the visionary aspects of where things are going and what we can do. But it's that part of what can we do and how we do it that also drives us to be more creative and more collaborative. So we were looking and had done a bit of research with the European Space Agency on future habitation on the planet of Mars. And that whole process of not having access to infrastructure, not having access to air and water, to be completely off of the grid, let alone how do you manufacture something that can address these variables of living on another planet, was a very interesting exercise. And I don't know if Yasmin, if you have any other insights to share on that and the work Colin and the team have been doing in New York.
Yeah, I can add a little bit. I wasn't involved in it, but I think, and also, you know, this type of projects often become seed projects for other efforts too. And I think there's something very important here. those kind of approaches where we're off the grid, but also we need to get these things to Mars. So we're talking about very small volumes, very different way of thinking about structures, about environments. And there was a lot of work done on deployable structures, for example, on modular structures that can fit into small environments. And how can we, this doesn't only apply to Mars either. Many of these learnings can be applied to many critical conditions that we find ourselves in our Earth. And I think this type of research approach, without being location specific, is really in our DNA, and we love doing this.
Well, and here's a great example. I was just thinking, the structural analysis to go into that module, the use of material, and sort of inherently the questions of how much is needed and could there be more engineered, and I say engineered, sort of innovation to address that with the least amount of material, but the structural integrity needed to sustain that system through flight to land and so on and so forth. And just imagine applying that methodology, as Yasmin mentioned, here, and how it comes back to influencing ideas around structure. I did see one of the questions in chat around timber, and maybe there's time we can talk about that too, because that's part of this equation.
So you know what, let's do it. There are a lot of questions about methodology. Rebecca asked about Lego, Trebecca about materials. Somebody else asked about timber. Tulu asked about tools. Noah asked about spread or density. We'll get to Noah's question in a second. Might as well go to the materials. Adele and Utsiva, hold your questions. We're going to go to that in a second. Druvika, are you there? Druvika, you had a question about materials. This seems like a good chance to incorporate Tolu's question about tools, Rebecca's question about Lego. Druvika, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
You want to ask a question about materials?
Yeah, I do. So somebody mentioned about C&D waste. So I wanted to know that, how do you get your construction and demolition waste treated or recycled? So do you have in-house facilities, or wait, can you hear me?
Keep going a little bit.
Am I audible enough?
It's, let me hold on, Druvika. We'll come back to you. Yasmin, Doug, and Mark. I think, Druvika, the question is materials. You were asking about some of the materials and you were going a deeper dive. I'll try to find maybe put it in the chat, Druvika, which material, and we'll look for that. But Doug, Yasmin, and Mark, you weren't care to speak about new materials, old materials, how you think about materials?
Yeah, I can start, and I'm sure Doug and Mark will have other things to add. I think, we're still living through the impacts of a big pandemic, and, this put a lot of emphasis on people's well-being and planet's well-being. And I think the two go hand in hand, and materials play quite an important role in this for our health, but also for the health of our planet. So, we think a lot, we consider the impact of materials that we use in our buildings, such as, use of natural materials like timber, etc., but also use of avoiding the use of red listed materials, making sure that the chemical content of these materials, we know them and they can be used appropriately, making sure that we understand the durability of them and the maintenance of them, but also making sure we understand the global warming potential of them. So we often prioritize low impact materials, both in terms of chemicals, but also in terms of carbon impact as well. So quite a broad and a complex equation, but we, as designers, I think we have to make sure that every aspect of our choices has to be considered carefully and diligently.
And for me, materials and policy are so intertwined. Like I'm out of Chicago, and in Chicago there is great hesitation centered around timber, utilizing timber in general construction, let alone mid-rise construction, let alone high-rise construction. And a lot of that stems from a fire that we had over 100 years ago, which is now silly. But a lot of what is preventing us from being able to do some of the things that people are mentioning in the chat all comes down to policy and what the current state of our codes. So, there is only so much that we can do until we can impact policy. And I think that that's something that the climate change project, that I really took away from the climate change project and the climate impact database that we are currently putting together, is that, the rubber meets the road. When we can impact policy, we can have a much larger conversation and have a greater degree of impact on our day-to-day lives in our individual cities.
Okay, let's use a policy example. Elaine, you had a question about LEED. How about that as an example? Is that a fair example? And Elaine, why don't you ask your question about LEED? It looked like you had it seemed like it was a good segue.
Yeah, I was just curious. I've heard differing things about how useful LEED or any sort of certification standard like that is. And I was just curious on your thoughts, if there were good ones, what some of the challenges of those sorts of standards are.
So I'll go out on a limb here, but I've heard this from someone else, so maybe it's not too much of a risk. LEED when it first came forward was very ambitious. Today, it's code in many municipalities. And so not doing LEED is not meeting code. And so at least to me, that's a point of departure to ask, what else can and more importantly should we do to address these challenges? So it pushed us in the right direction. Policy has caught up. We're now in many municipalities, it's code. And I think when Yasmin mentioned the work in New York City, there's policy now that is even getting ahead of LEED. And it's encouraging, but I think it's suggestive there's still more to be done. And I think it's from all of us continuing to push.
I do see, to Doug's point, like there's a lot of value in LEED. At times it can be a relatively hollow certificate that gets put on the outside of your building. But at the same time, it is asking the right questions, and it is moving the needle to some degree in terms of the overall performance of our buildings. And you've even seen the evolution of LEED over the years. What started out as primarily just an energy-based series of criteria has expanded itself. I'm seeing a lot of value in some of the more holistic approaches to these certifications. Like Doug and I are working on a project that is living community challenge, with one of the buildings being intending to be a living building certified project. And that takes into account energy, carbon, materials, but also even the health and wellness of the individual occupants. So it's kind of synergizing the aspirations of LEED and the aspirations of WELL into one rating system. So I see the industry going in that direction, a more holistic approach. And I think that would have a lot more value in terms of the overall impact.
I think maybe the last thing to add to this, earlier we showed you a chart to say that we're monitoring the performance of our projects. I want to just add here, not just LEED, but any certification systems that exist around the world, the top level of this are some of our best performing projects. So not to forget that, they do make a difference actually, but of course they also have levels. I think what Doug said is correct, that LEED silver these days is probably not something exceptional, but platinum actually will make a difference.
Sam, I think it's a great question. And by the way, Doug, Yasmin, we're not asking you to name names. This is just a great values question. Good.
My question was just, have you at SOM ever said no to a project because of a difference in values?
That's a great question.
Well, no, I want to be thoughtful in how we answer this, because yes, there are projects that we just don't pursue for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's because others can do it better. But the question of, have you ever turned down a project? Because of that, we're not often put in that situation to have to turn down a project because of its environmental commitments. And, you know, I am certain that we've had conversations with clients that they almost became negotiations to get some level of commitment on the value of that project. And maybe in many ways, the result of that was through other incentives or offsite solutions that they were more comfortable with. But we were able to move, I think, as opposed to just saying no, we like to push and ask again and see how far we can move it down the field before we say no.
So a couple of questions, some of the questions have to do with the aesthetic, and Adele, get ready, because Utsavi, I think that the Wi-Fi connection is spotty for Utsavi. So Adele, you had a similar question to Utsavi. The question of new and old, you know, everything is new, but sometimes there's a matter of keep sustaining the old. Adele, do you want to ask a question?
I had a question regarding historical preservation and more older buildings. And there's a lot of incentive to keep buildings as they were and maintain their historical value through historical tax credits. And I was curious if y'all had ever run into any issues with trying to retrofit older buildings with more sustainable and newer design features while still trying to maintain that historical value. And I wasn't sure how you balance those two needs.
I can talk to a project maybe. So I worked quite a bit in Europe in the past, and you know, a lot of the European city centers are full of projects with historical value, and they will be at different capacities, let's say. And sometimes actually when the projects are listed or they have such a historic value that they should not be altered from inside, that does not mean that they cannot meet today's performance requirements, but we look at alternative strategies such as insulating from inside, adding a layer of glazing on the inside, or replacing the glazing with exactly the same, just with argon filled. Or so I think the technology at that stage really helps us. The technological improvements help us. And we also use the technology to do this too. Sometimes adding to an existing building is smart systems, BMS controls that can really be fully integrated to the life of the building and the life of the users. So I think in those ones, we have to think creatively on how do we maintain the character and actually enhance the value of the building by thinking smartly.
Gracie, I think you have a follow-up question to that. I think it's a good follow-up question, Gracie.
Yeah, it's kind of going in the opposite directions as old buildings, more of in the concept of new buildings. How do y'all really integrate sustainable design with like aesthetic appeal? Like I've seen buildings with like really incorporating greenery or different shapes to make it look really nice, just because no one wants like a plain building. Everyone likes a like nice, exciting looking building, I guess.
Yeah, I guess one thing I'll say to that is we do need to walk a fine, as architects and designers, we do need to walk a fine line in how we showcase the green initiatives that we integrate into our buildings, because technology is a fickle thing. It evolves so quickly that, you know, you put today's hot product on your building, or you design for today's hot product, and by the time it actually gets built, that's outdated technology. So you'll notice in a lot of our buildings, they're not blanketed in photovoltaics or, you know, other integrated sustainable solutions for, I think, a large that being a big reason for that. You know, we try and build timeless buildings that you don't necessarily date just by looking at them. So in my opinion, we as designers need to walk a fine line about which technologies we integrate and celebrate, which technologies just become part of the base building, and then what elements of a project do we really want to broadcast and and make a main feature of the building. You mentioned greenery. That's something that's never going to change. That's not something that ever is going to go out of fashion, you know, access to outdoor space, access to nature. So it's those, I see it in a lot of our work today. Those are the moments, those are the opportunities that we're looking to celebrate, that we're looking to push on our clients, that we're looking to integrate in each and every one of our projects, because those, you know, they're not necessarily providing energy for us per se, but they're certainly addressing some of the health and wellness benefits that we see with people's direct interaction with nature and outdoor space.
It'll likely continue to evolve, because what Mark described is sort of what we're seeing today. And I think there is a new ethos, new language around sustainable, high performance approaches to building design that will continue to emerge. But the fundamentals are actually rooted in a vernacular that were applied generations ago in how you best respond to the local environment in which you're building. Whether it was through local material selection, whether it was ways to deal with heat and cooling and to address the sun and to address the rain. In many ways, you can take your cues from there and then use all of the insights we've gained since then to address these other issues of material efficiency, technology, and of course, beautiful design.
No, I had a question. You mentioned, Doug, about tendencies and trends, all of you, Mark and Yasmin too. Noah, you had a question about, that kind of was raising this question about what is the next trend, or perhaps do we cut back, or does the pendulum shift back? Noah, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, my question was, there's a lot of emphasis on large cities and urbanization. Do you think it would be advantageous to kind of push back against that trend of urbanization? Or is it kind of inevitable at this point and we need to kind of adapt to make these large cities as efficient as possible?
There's a question in there you didn't ask, which is, what's the alternate? A more polycentric or decentralized model? I'm sure that was in there.
Good job, Noah.
It's a very interesting question. I think there's a number of things to consider, and it does come down to systems. There was research done by NYU, published a couple of years ago, that looked at urbanization over the last 100 years. And as the population's been increasing, the immediate thought was we were densifying our cities. And of course, a percentage of that growth was through densification of cities. The majority, though, and this was what was surprising to me, is that that population growth was met through horizontal expansion of our footprints, the footprint of our urban areas. And so that's just one point of discussion. Another is you take an existing city like Chicago that has seen dramatic population loss over the last 30 years, just returning now. But a lot of that footprint of the municipality of Chicago is not dense at all. In fact, the issues of vacancy, think of Detroit, the number of streets and infrastructure, but yet vacancy in that city. Those cities could probably see a doubling of the population, which would not be about over-densifying, but taking advantage of existing infrastructure and distribution of resources in a way that could be highly sustainable. And so I think it's a little of both. And the last thing I'll say, Noah, and why I brought up the decentralized or polycentric question, is there are other parts of the world when it may make sense to look more at a decentralized model that puts the environment and the integrity of those natural systems first, to define where we can build, where we can't build. So it resets the priorities, and that might be more appropriate in some parts of the world, less so in others. And I think being aware and actually tailoring the correct response is really what we're advocating.
We're down to getting close to the end here, and the audience has always been great about asking that really big, difficult, challenging question, and I think we've got this one. It comes from a couple of people. We got one from Jimmy and from Detroit. It turns out, Doug, you mentioned Detroit. Well, we got a question from Jeff Grace at MIT, and also one of the fellows asked this question too. I'll give you some advance notice. It has to do with climate change anxiety. One of you put up, I think you put up a quote from Nathaniel Owings, civilization, leaves a mark on the earth by which they are known and judged, was a quote that he said. I think you can replace the word civilization with individuals also leave a mark on the earth by which we can known and judged too. You all speak about a holistic approach. SOM takes this holistic approach. You have a 30,000 foot view. And there's been a question throughout from last year, the 10th annual SISE conference, Secretary Chu, the Nobel Prize winner, former Secretary of Energy, he talked about the need, he takes this 30,000 foot view and people say, how do you not get down? How do you not get depressed? And he says, you have to compartmentalize. Dr. Miner says, you just got to keep fighting. Mariana Grossman, an earlier speaker, says, yeah, it's happening, but what else are you going to do? You all, Doug, Mark, Yasmin, you have a 30,000 foot view. And when you take that, when you have that perspective, how do you, you see things that others don't. How do you not get down? What's your advice? What's your climate change anxiety, and how do you see tomorrow?
Oh, maybe I'll go first. I'm actually an optimist, and I hope I'm not the only one here. Yes, I think it's the biggest challenge of our times, I think, and it will continue to be for a long time. Yet I think we're here for a reason, and we do the work that we do for a reason. We have a chance to make a difference, every single one of us, not just in our professional lives, but also in our personal lives too. So I think we all have to try hard. And we spoke about there's not one silver bullet. One person cannot solve it. One company cannot solve it either. So we have to work together. But also, I think what keeps us, what keeps me positive in this journey is I don't think we've ever been closer to a solution than we are now. Yes, it's not looking great, but look at the awareness that is building around the globe. I mean, school kids taking action, cities committing significant commitments. And not just the Western world either, the whole globe we're talking about. And we're talking about individual scale, city scale, state scale, federal scale. So yes, the challenge is here, but I don't think we've ever been closer than where we are now. And I think it will only go in that direction, and we all have to walk this walk together on the same journey.
I agree with Yasmin. I mean, I get educated by my daughter most every dinner about what she's learning at school in terms of sustainability, and apparently all of our buildings need to have trees in them, or at least that's what I've been told by my 7-year-old daughter. And really, for me, that's what it is. I am somewhat maybe I'm not as big of an optimist as Yasmin, but fall somewhat under the camp of, well, what else are you going to do? We all know that this is a huge issue, or sorry, the vast majority of us know that this is a huge issue that needs to be dealt with. And for me, I look at my 2 kids, and in the end, I don't want them in 15 years from now asking me, what did I do to move the needle, or why didn't I do something to help move the needle? So, to me, it's about looking towards the future and looking at the mark that we ultimately leave, and wanting to make sure that that's a positive mark that we leave, and not a negative mark.
Doug?
Yeah, I am concerned because there's great urgency still. And so conversations like today are really great to see the energy and focus around this topic. I guess the reason that I'm hopefully optimistic, excitedly optimistic, is we as a firm, and we're a small little practice, have seen the power of the collective, of working together towards a common goal. And I do think we will get there. And Yasmin and Mark are both right. The pendulum has swung. There's more people talking about sustainability now. There's technology and information that makes things visible and accessible that we didn't have before. So we're definitely kind of headed in the right direction, but I think we all would like to see us get there faster.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate your optimism, all of you. Thank you. It's a what else are we going to do, right? We appreciate your optimism, and thank you for the reminder of that collaboration works best. Thomas, I think that's a great way to close this session. Something to think about as we move on to the next session, which starts tomorrow on capital markets. Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Doug, very much.
Thank you very much for having us. Such a pleasure.